If a person would ask a question, what is the purpose of creation? Person believes in God, and he believes God created this world. Didn't come about through the Big Bang or through some other position of how it came about, whether it was ancient, it always was here. He asked the person, if God created the world, what was the value and purpose of creation? You ask the person that question. And the person has a chumash, what we call the Bible. And you say to him, the answer is in the Bible. God tells you in the text of the Bible exactly what the objective of creation was. What's its purpose? It's within the first 3 words of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. And as we mentioned many times, the word Bereshis, what it means is for the sake of Bereshis. God created this world for the sake of Bereshis, for the sake of the chosen, for the sake of what's the choicest. What is this? For the sake of Torah, which is called Bereshis. The Torah is the blueprint of existence. It preceded existence. And it's the objective of existence. The only people who have relevance to that are people who are classified as the chosen. Who are these people? The Jewish people. So within the keyword, the answer to this question, which is the most important question of existence, is alluded to in the first 3 words of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, God, for the sake of Bereshis, God created heaven and earth. Now we speak about it's for the sake of the Jewish people through the observance of Torah. Person is educated, gets himself a quality education, works for a corporation. Now, why does he work for that corporation? Why? Only to be compensated financially. Otherwise, why work? So when we speak about reward or compensation or bonus, what is the value of that? Because I invested my time and my ability and my expertise due to my education, so and so, therefore, I deserve to be compensated. Whatever that compensation package is, that's what it is. We as Jews who live in this existence have come into existence 3,400 years ago when we were taken as God's chosen people at Sinai. Why do we observe the Torah? To be rewarded. What is reward? Reward can mean a lot of things. You have unlimited financial resources. There's nothing that you can't do. Every comfort, every amenity of life is available to you due to your level of accomplishment. But if that is what it's about, what is the purpose of existence? To succeed, to do God's will, to be compensated. What's compensation? Something that I'm a beneficiary of. How do we understand beneficiary? Beneficiary means, to me, I should receive something. I should receive something. Even in the spiritual realm, God will give me endless shares in the spiritual realm. But that's not what it is. How do we know that's not what it is? In a few words, in one verse, the Torah tells us what it's about. In this week's reading, we read, it's the second portion of the reading is Kedoshim. You should be holy. You should be sanctified. And Hashem says to Moshe, tell the Jewish people, Daber el kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Speak to the total congregation of the Jewish people. And you should say to them, Kedoshim to you. You must live a life of Kedusha, of sanctity. Why? Because I am holy. Because I am holy, That's why you should live a life of sanctity. The question is, what does one thing have to do with another? The reason why we have to live a life, whatever we live, because God is the master, we're his subjects. And he says, if you live a certain life, you're deserving of reward. What does that do with God's holiness? You'd say God is equitable. God is just. He keeps his word. It has nothing to do with him being holy. So what do you mean? You should be holy because I'm holy. Evidently, we see there's a linkage between the way we live our lives within the context of the protocols of the Torah and God's holiness. There's some kind of connection. You should live a life of Kedusha, of holiness, sanctity, because I'm holy. So Rashi in his commentary cites the Midrash. What is Kedusha? What is holiness rooted in? That if a person does not engage in illicit sexual activity. What is that? Such as incest, incestual relationships, which was discussed in last week's reading, this week's reading. Last portion, this portion. Incestual relationships. That's the antithesis of holiness. Because we find wherever we speak about that area being not appropriately addressed, we find there's a lack of Kedusha, lack of holiness. Okay? We find that the Jewish people accepted the Torah at Sinai. So according to the Babylonian Talmud, what we call Talmud Bavli, God offered the Torah to all the nations in the world, and they turned it down. Because it says it doesn't meet our so-called our lifestyle. But they asked, what's it all about? And God says, it's not our cup of tea. God said, not a problem. You choose to reject it, reject it. He offers it to the Jewish people. They say, Naseh v'nishma. We accept unequivocally. We embrace it. So God did offer it. You rejected it. The Jews accepted it. But there's a Midrash. The Midrash says differently. God offered the Torah immediately to the Jewish people, did not offer it to the nations of the world, didn't offer it to them. And after he offered it to the Jewish people, nations of the world come with a complaint. God, why are you playing favorites? As you offered it to the Jews, why don't you offer it to us? So God asks them a question. When we accounted in the Torah, it says the Jews brought the documents of pedigree. God attests to the fact that every Jew who left Egypt is the issue of his father and mother. The mother did not commit adultery. There was no incestuous relationships. The pedigree is pure and holy. So God says, do you know who my children are? They're purebreds. There's no impurity in their pedigree. You people, you're all products of incest, adultery. Therefore, you have no relevance to my Torah. The Jewish people have relevance to my Torah. You have no relevance to my Torah. When the nations of the world heard this, it says, there's a verse in Eshes Chayil, which is the last chapter of Proverbs. It says, Kamul v'neve Yashua. The sons rose and they began extolling the Jewish people. They never heard of such a thing. That the Jewish people, there's no incest, there's no adultery. They're pure. It's unheard of. But nations of the world, somehow they can't control themselves. This area is breached. And because if you breach that area, you have no relevance to a relationship with God. But the Jewish people kept that pure and under control, and they had the lid on that. They did not allow their desires to dictate their lives, to cross those lines. Therefore, they have relevance to holiness, and you people don't have relevance to holiness. That's the Midrash. So again, that's going, what's the basis for Kedusha? What's the greatest drive in a human being? One of the greatest drives, the sexual drive. And if the sexual drive is not in check, God forbid, it's uncontrolled, there's no stopping. It goes wherever it could go, that's where it goes. Whether it's adultery, whether it's incest, whether it's bestiality. But if you go and put the lid on it and say, we don't cross lines in this area whatsoever, that person has control over his life. Therefore, Rashi cites the Midrash, what's Kedoshim to you? You should be holy. That whenever the areas of sexuality are not breached, that person is classified as a holy person. However, Ramban Nachmanides explains it differently, not in contradiction with Rashi is saying. He says a person can live a life of being an observant Jew, but he lives like an intellectual animal. What does this mean? If a person lives a life of hedonism, immersed, indulging in food, but all the food he eats meets the standard of kashrus at the highest level. He drinks wine, the vintage is one of a kind, and he drinks himself into a stupor. A man has a harem of wives that there's no moment of the day that he can't engage with them sexually. So he's never violating the law of what? Of adultery. Every wife is bound to the laws of family purity because he has enough variety that every number of his wives are always in the pure state. What is this person? He lives like an animal. Life is purely indulgence at the most extreme level of hedonism. That person has no relevance to Kedusha. Kedusha means you reflect God's persona. That's what Kedusha is. You use the material only as what? As a means to an end. If a person becomes intoxicated and allows that desire to overwhelm his life and to overtake his life, you breathe and you live and you sleep. Only the desire, the passion, desire, and drive. That's all. That's what life becomes. Once that happens, there's no room for God in your life whatsoever. So, Kedoshim to you, what is the objective of life? Not to be the intellectual animal, not to live a life of hedonism, but to use the material as a means to facilitate the spirituality. But what does that mean? The objective of life is to have a relation with God. And to have a relation with God, you have to reflect his essence, which has no relevance to physicality. And then you can focus on the development and advancement of that spirituality, which is the essence of what the soul is all about. This is the concept. Kedoshim to you, it's a positive commandment. Do not live as an intellectual animal. Live as that spiritual person who surpasses the angel and only utilize the physicality and material of the world to facilitate your spirituality and to actualize it. There's a mitzvah on Shabbos, it's called Oneg Shabbos. We eat foods which are tasty, enjoyable on Shabbos. That's a positive commandment. Of course, we're commemorating the creation of existence. The festivals come. There's a mitzvah, you must rejoice in the festivals. Rejoicing is eating meat, drinking wine. To what degree? Within reason. But that's a mitzvah. If it's for the sake of a mitzvah, not for the sake of indulgence, that physical act is a spiritualization. It's not for the sake of the food. The food is only a means to fulfill the mitzvah of rejoicing on the holiday, on the festival. So in this verse, when it says, tell the Jewish people, Kedoshim to you, you should be holy, as the Ramban, as Nachmanides explains it. Because I am holy. And God says, because I am holy. What does that say? What is the objective of existence? What's considered we've succeeded? We've spiritualized ourselves sufficiently that the world, you know what the world to come is? Is having a relation with God. God is the essence of everything. He's absolute in every aspect of his being. And he's the source of all goodness. And if you could cleave and be part of that goodness, you succeeded. Now you've achieved the ultimate. But you can only bask in his radiance if you have that relevance to his radiance. But if you live the life purely materially, immersed, sunken in that, at a level, you have no relevance to his radiance. That radiance has no relevance to the physical world. But if you use the physical world as a means, because we're created as human beings, as part of the challenge, and we've made that challenge, and not only did we spiritualize our souls, we even spiritualize our physicality to use the physicality within the context of doing his will. Ultimately, at the time of resurrection, that body will be resurrected, that both body and soul will be able to bask in God's radiance of holiness, which is the concept of what? Of resurrection. And that's the concept, the ultimate concept of reward and punishment. Now you're being compensated and rewarded for your level of sacrifice that you sacrificed on behalf of God, despite the temptations, which were the antithesis of what that was. So in the few words, you should be holy because I am holy, that tells us that's what the world to come is about. That's what reward is about. Reward is not to be compensated, but reward is become who you're supposed to be, and then you could have that ultimate relationship, which is considered the ultimate in terms of accomplishment and benefit. You will merit the ultimate level of goodness, which is the relation with God himself. So as we find in the first words of the Torah, it tells us what the value of existence is. For the sake of Torah and for the sake of the Jewish people, and everything revolves around that. This creation which borders on the infinite, the physical, the spiritual, the angel realm, whatever it is, the species, all that is a means to an end. What's the means? It's a means for the Torah, and it's a means for the Jewish people to achieve that level of spirituality of perfection. And at what level? When you use it as a means, not as an end. Because the means is to, the end is to become spiritualized, to be able to cleave to God, who's the essence of holiness. Now, there's a basic question which was asked. There's an expression, you can't straddle both sides of the fence. Either you're at point A or point B. But a person has one foot in both worlds. And when he's in the other world, it's for the sake of the other world, not to facilitate the spiritual world. You're nowhere. You're not in the spiritual world, you're not in the physical world. There's a famous story. This had to do with Netanyahu's father. Bibi and Netanyahu's father. Bibi's father was a genius. And initially he was a student, a yeshiva student in Lithuania. And he went to a certain yeshiva. The name of the yeshiva was Nevardok. There's a city called Nevardok in Lithuania. And he attended that yeshiva. And the head of the yeshiva's name was Rabbi Horowitz. And it was a real Musa yeshiva. People to perfect their behavior, take control of their lives, perfect their characteristics, and take control over their desires, in conjunction with studying the Talmud at an advanced level. And Netanyahu's father, at the age of 19, was there a number of years. And I said he was an exceptional student. He fled the yeshiva under the cover of night because he was too ashamed to go to the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, say, I've had enough, this is not for me. He couldn't say that. So he fled under the cover of night, left. And he became a professor, college professor. And he became a non-religious Jew. Ultimately, initially, he wasn't observant. Towards his later years, he came back to his Judaism. Tanyahu's father was an observant Jew. In his later years, it was known the reason why Netanyahu was in Harvard because his father was a professor in Harvard. I think he had a doctorate in history, his father. But so when he left the yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, this Rabbi Horowitz, said, this Netanyahu, he's not going to have this world, he's not going to have the world to come. He's not going to be able to benefit from this world, the desire of this world, because it's going to be so embedded in him, the conscience of not turning your back on God, even when he partakes of the world, it's going to be with a guilt conscience. So he's not going to have a share in this world, not the world to come. The world to come is because he turned his back on the world to come. Gave it up. And this world, even when he partakes of it, it's with such a level of guilt he's not going to be able to enjoy it. That was his comment, this great rabbi. But there's nothing wrong with using this world and enjoying it if it's to facilitate the spirituality. It's only if the world is an end unto itself. But if the world is only a means to advance the spirituality, to extend the spirituality, the physicality takes on a spiritual value, a spiritual persona. So there's a mitzvah to celebrate the Yom Tov and to enjoy it, wine and meat, and to celebrate and to be in a state of joy. That's the mitzvah. But so using the material to create the setting, but what do you joyous over what? Because you just bought that antique, or you just bought that racehorse from one of the princes in Saudi Arabia, and you have a stable of horses, like he has a stable of horses, or you have that Rolls Royce and a whole stable of cars, whatever you want to call it, and you have enough, you could go into the car, you could become a dealer of Bentley and Rolls Royces and whatever, Aston Martins, just on the amount of garage space you have. Maybe, you never know. That's not what it's about. There's a story, there was a person who lived in England. He was knighted by the Queen. His name was Sir Isaac Wolfson. That was his name. He was an observant Jew. There's a towers in Israel called Wolfson Towers in Jerusalem. Apartment complex. He built it. Sir Isaac Wolfson, he never had children. And he was an observant man. And he had a nephew who was more than observant, a learned Jew. And it was his brother's son. And he left all his wealth when he passed away to that son in Israel. Did a lot of great things with that wealth. And Sir Isaac Wolfson, his rabbi, his name was Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky. Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky was the head of the London Rabbinic Court from 1920 through the war for about 30 years. He emigrated to Israel in the 50s. And he was a great Torah sage. He was a colleague of the Brisker Rov. They studied together in Volozhin in Lithuania. And he was his rabbi. And he's a man, he wore like a frock, Mr. Wolfson. He was a sir, wore a top hat. And when he would finish praying in the afternoon, his chauffeur limousine, Rolls Royce, would pull up, and the chauffeur would come out, open the doors, they would open from the center. So you could go straight into this limousine Rolls Royce, and Mr. Wolfson, Isaac Wolfson goes in. First, Rabbi Abramsky, of blessed memory, says in Yiddish, because he was a Lithuanian Jew, he says, Mr. Abramsky, Mr. Wolfson, not Sir Wolfson. Come out, Royce, you got to come out. You come out of the car. First, the rabbi goes in, then you follow. That's what he told him. What you did is not respectful. Come out. He's talking to a person who's the equivalent of a billionaire in those years. Come out. First, Torah goes in. After Torah goes in, then you follow. This is what he spoke to the Sir Isaac Wolfson. Sir Isaac Wolfson took it without a problem. Wasn't insulted. He says, Rabbi, you're right. I did the wrong thing. You understand? So this man's wealth coming out and letting the rabbi go in. What is he using his wealth? In what ways is he displaying his Rolls Royce limousine? All this is to honor the rabbi. He deserves greater honor than I, although I own it. Although I made that fortune. The rabbi's primary, I'm secondary. Understand? That's means, that's not end. The people are very wealthy people. And they have a special rabbi coming to their home, and they have him Friday night for dinner. Where do you think they put the rabbi? At the head of the table. Although it's your home and you own everything, But what's the honor of the host? That the rabbi sits at the head of the table. Because he is that special person. He's the personality. So Kedoshim to you. If you utilize material to do the will of God, that's a sanctification process. That's a means, not an end. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh asks a question. It's a very good question. Let's say a person goes and he fulfills the Torah. And you do it out of love, you do it out of reverence, you do it at the most extensive level. But you know something? Although cohabitation or procreation is an obligation, although priests, lahavdil, are celibate, because they say that a human being has to engage in the act of procreation, that's the original sin. Yeah, that's original sin. And because the priest is removed from that, he's not permitted to do that, therefore he's celibate. Our religion says, the Torah says, God says, that if you don't engage in procreation, you deserve that your life should be taken. Because you were created to perpetuate and continue this existence. If procreation is the first positive commandment in the Torah. Chizkiyahu, the king of Judah, because he didn't procreate initially, because he had seen in his divine vision, he was going to have a son who was medieval, he did not procreate. And he's on his deathbed, ready to die. And Isaiah the prophet, Yeshaya Novi, comes to him and says, do you know why you're not coming out of that sick bed? Because you did not procreate. So what's procreation? Procreation is what is an act which is naturally a sexual act, and it's pleasurable. How do you expect the person to engage in a sexual act, even when it's permitted, that he shouldn't somehow be tempted to have other sexual relationships? It's like a person taking drugs, God forbid, and you're allowing something to enter into the system which craves some more of the same. So how could the Torah command us to be holy and engage in actions and activities which actually stoke the coals of temptation, and yet we have to keep a lid on it? That's the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. That's what he addresses. So he says something interesting. Kedoshim to you. You must be holy. Now the question is, but how do you conquer the beast when you tell me to become the beast? Engaging in sexual activity, even in a permitted context. When a person does that act for the sake of a mitzvah, although it's less pleasurable than, God forbid, doing the wrong thing, because it's done within the context of mitzvah, it creates a spiritual aura. That spiritual aura protects you, that you don't cross lines, to go in areas where you don't belong, of sexuality. That's what God is saying. Kedoshim to you. You should be holy because I'm holy. So when I give you the commandments, the positive commandments, to engage in them, that's part of a sanctification process. Why? Because that's my will. So it's coupled with that component of spiritualization, therefore it has no ill effect on you. We eat. We're supposed to enjoy the food on the festivals, on the Shabbos. But when you enjoy something, wine, food, meat, fish, whatever it is, or baked goods, you're whetting the appetite. You're going in the direction of hedonism, to indulge. If you do it for the sake of the mitzvah, it will generate an aura of spirituality, of holiness, that will protect you. You're not going to cross that line. You're going to be able to take control of your life. You should be holy, ki kodesh, because I'm the source of that obligation. And if it emanates from me, it has no ill effect. And this is what King Solomon says in Koheles, Osa mitzvah lo yeda davaro. When you do a mitzvah, it doesn't have a negative consequence. It doesn't have any ill effect. Because the mitzvah itself is rooted in the source of spirituality. And therefore, as a result of that, it only has a positive effect, no negative effect, for that reason. I had mentioned many times, we mentioned this recently, that a Jew could be as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a midrash, and the Rambam says this in the Laws of Tshuva. And we explained many times that if we meet our potential, we're no less than Moshe Rabbeinu. Somebody says, it seems to be pretty pompous and arrogant. I could be like Moshe Rabbeinu. No, I'm happy to be the humble little guy on the block. I don't need all that. God says, and who said my potential is more than I'm doing? God says, Kedoshim. And if you study Hebrew grammar, there's past tense, there's present tense, and there's future tense. Kedoshim tihiyu. Tihiyu means you shall be in the future, meaning your capacity for holiness is unlimited. And this is what I mentioned to you this morning. As long as we're alive, and God gives those years and those minutes and those hours in life, it only means saved because you still could advance yourself. That's only indication of your capacity. So therefore, Kedoshim tihiyu. Kedusha has many levels. A person can be holy, but as holy as well, we're not at the holiness of Moshe Rabbeinu. So there are various levels of holiness. As long as we're alive, we continue to contribute and invest in that area, our level of holiness keeps increasing and keeps advancing, keeps soaring. Why? Because just as my holiness is unlimited, because God is infinite, if the objective is to have the relation with me, the more you advance your holiness, the greater is the level of relationship. Because you've created a greater level of commonality between yourself and myself for that reason. That's the understanding. Certain things make no sense. A person earns $1 billion, $5 billion. You have enough money that there's nothing you can't have if you lived 1,000 years, based on what you have. But yet, Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, whatever you have, you are multiples of what you have. You have $1 billion, you want $2 billion. You have $2 billion, you want $4 billion. What do you need it for? You have so much, there's nothing that you can't have. You just keep going. It's like an addiction. Why? If actually there's nothing that you can't buy or have what you have, why have more? Doesn't make sense. But yet, it's like infectious. It's an addiction. You have, the more material you have, the more you want. That's the reality. Because just as in our spirituality, we have an unlimited capacity to advance, the other side of the equation is, in material, there's always more to advance. There's no limit to what you could have. Yeah, that's the counterbalance. Spirituality, it's limitless. The physical side, it's limitless. And as much as you have, you're never satisfied. You always want to up the ante. Up it. For whatever reason. Whether it's ego, to be the richest. I don't want to be number 2, I want to be number 1. And if I want to be number 1, I don't want anybody inching up on me. So I'm going to go beyond number 1. Then nobody should be able to get near me. So it's ego-driven for the person to keep advancing. But on the spiritual side, it's also unlimited. But there you have to have an appreciation for what the value is, because you want to have that relation with God. As God is unlimited in terms of what you're able to benefit from him, your level of advancement is unlimited to be able to achieve and be a beneficiary of that level of relationship. So that's the counterbalance. And that's the concept. But God can't create us and give us obligations which are impossible for us to fulfill if we create the problem for ourselves, because the more we do, the more we actually entice and engage the evil inclination to want more of it. The Gemara tells us that God created a human being with a small organ. It's called the male organ. The more you sate it, the hungrier it becomes. The more you suppress it, the more satisfied it becomes. Works the opposite. The more you give into it, the more you want more of it. And the less you engage in it, you have control over it. That's the reality of a human being. But yet, you have an obligation to a degree. You have conjugal obligations to your wife. You have other obligations. Obligation to procreate. If that's the case, God wants you to go into the fire. But I'm in the fire, how could I survive it? I'm being drawn. I'm going into the opium den. Lahavdim. No. Because as long as you do within the parameters of the Torah prescribes, you're protected. Because that act, although it's physical at the most advanced level, it's totally consuming of the person, that act is a spiritualization act. I'll give you an example. Certain tractates in the Talmud, which discusses many things, which has to do with the sexuality of the man and the woman. And everything. What exactly is cohabitation? What is adultery? What's incest? Is it penetration? Is it this? It's that? All different things. If you study within the context of Torah, it's not lahavdil, has anything to do with illicit material you're studying. You study Kedusha. You study holiness. And the material, when you process that and try to understand it, it doesn't have any effect on you. You don't stop hyperventilating and start going to thinking about certain things. You don't. Because since you're doing it as the mitzvah of studying of Torah, it doesn't have that negative effect. But God forbid, you read any material which is pornographic, God forbid, it touches you in a sensuous way, and it touches certain parts of your being that you become preoccupied, consumed with that. And God forbid, it has to be satisfied. And it goes, God forbid, from bad to worse. And you have to nip it in the bud, not to let it go beyond that point. Because it's within the context of unacceptable thought, involvement, investment. I had a question many years ago. A certain person was an investor, and he asked me, could he invest in a publishing house that publishes pornographic material? That's what he said to me. And the profit margin was phenomenal. So I told him, definitely not. Why? Because there's a concept known, we read in Pirkei Avos, if a person's a sinner and he causes others to sin, it's a terrible thing. You're creating a pitfall for humanity. This is a menace for society to create this material, because people, when they engage in that and read that, it's not going to better society. It's going to cause society going in direction which is everything contrary to what spirituality is all about. You will not, I told him, you will not see any blessing from that investment. You may make a fortune, but the end of the game is you're not going to have bracha from that. Because anything which is not within the context of neutral or mitzvah, it's disaster. I had another case, a person asked me a question. This person was a partner in Iron Pay's architectural firm, and he was asked to make a design of a church. Was he permitted to? So I told him there's a way he could do it, where it's not a halachic question. But I said, one thing I could tell you, whatever fee you're going to get, you'll never see bracha from that money. Even legally, you may be permitted, but blessing you're never going to see from that money. Because that's for the sake of something which has no relevance to Kedusha, to holiness. It's even the antithesis of that. So bracha will have. Bracha only comes from something which has relevance to Kedusha. That's not Kedusha for that reason.